All right, so last time we learned about the first wave of Aliyah back to Israel at the beginning of the Bayit Sheni period after the 70 years of exile in Bavel, and we saw that although the story got off to a very promising and positive note, there started to be cracks very early on, namely with the very low turnout of people who were coming back with that first wave of Aliyah. Now, what was the exact number of people? If you guessed 42,359, you're wrong, but you're very close. Sefer Ezra, Perek Beis, Pasuk Samach Dalid, as chapter 2, Pasuk verse 64, gives us the number. We skipped over this last time. We save it for this time. Kol HaKahol Ka'echad, all of the people, all of the group as one, Arba Ribo Alpayim Shloshmios Shishim, were 42,360. Now, when I first wrote my Sefer, Go Up Like a Wall, in 2014, I noted that was roughly half the size of a medium-sized city in Israel. I was thinking of Beit Shemesh at the time. Beit Shemesh had a little bit more than twice that number of people. Since that time, about 50,000 more people, according to the official numbers, have moved into Beit Shemesh. So now there are more than 3 times the number of people in Beit Shemesh alone, one fairly large size city in Israel today, than the entire group of Jews living in Israel that were charged with rebuilding the country and rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash. When we think of it in that terms, we realize what a tiny number that is, especially when we consider the fact that many of these people were elderly, as we also saw last time. How are they supposed to ward off their enemies, the foreign occupiers of the land who are not pleased to see them come back? How are they supposed to deal with all the challenges of building the Beis Hamikdash and building a country when there was such a tiny number of people? Now, we don't know what percentage of the entire nation it was at the time, because, of course, the 10 tribes, most of them were still in exile. The remaining 2 tribes, for the most part, remained in Bavel and Persia. We don't know how many people there were over there. The Jews had undergone a major bloodletting just 70 years earlier. There was a Holocaust with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So 42,360 may be a fairly significant percentage of the total possible people who could have come. But even so, when we think of it, at least in present terms, it's a very, very small number of people. And we'll see from the way the Navi is critical of them, we'll see that in a future shiur. Hashem was very not pleased with this turnout, which indicates that it was in fact a very small percentage of the total people that could have come. So be all that as it may, the building stopped. They laid the foundation of the Beis Hamikdash. Then there was a building freeze for 18 years. And essentially, the Jews in Israel gave up hope after that. They said, look, we tried. We gave it our best effort. Clearly, Hashem doesn't want us to build a Beis Hamikdash at this time. And they turned their attention to their own personal lives and their private affairs. And that is when Chagai and Zechariah start speaking to them. Okay, it actually says that in beginning in Sefer Ezra, the beginning of Perek Hey, chapter 5, that after the building freeze was completed, at least the amount of time that needed to be to round out the 70 years, because they started counting wrongly. They started the counting a little bit too early, so they thought the 70 years expired sooner than it actually did. Then Chagai and Zechariah started to speak to the people to awaken them. So we're going to turn our attention now to Sefer Chagai. It is only 2 prakim. The Hebrew is fairly easy Hebrew. The average person who's fairly learned can go through Chagai probably in a half hour or even less. It's not difficult at all. And yet, from what I can tell, it's not a very widely studied Sefer. And very few people have probably studied it at all. And when I learned this, I was blown away by how practical and relevant it is to our times. Chagai could be standing and speaking to us today. So before we jump into the actual text of Chagai, I'm going to go into it in great detail. I want to share with you the Malbim's comments, his opening comments to the Sefer. This is really mind-blowing. He says, Kvar Bir Harav Yitzchak Abarbanel. So the Abarbanel has already explained. The Anochi Chazon here Basi Boseh Bekama Makamos. And I have enlarged or expanded this vision in many places, meaning I've sort of expanded on this theme in several places. Because from the time of the first exile in the times of Sancherev, which is when the first Beis Hamikdash was still standing, the exile happened in various stages. When Sancherev kicked out the first Jews, that already started the time of the future redemption, which is not how we might think of it at first glance. We would think this is still the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and the Beis Hamikdash was on a downward trend. But we're not talking about the future redemption when we still have the Beis Hamikdash and a large chunk of the Jewish people living in Israel. We have Jewish kings, we have a Beis Hamikdash, we have probably millions of Jews living in Israel. Why are we talking about a future redemption when we're still here? The Malbim says, no, that was already the clock starting to tick for the ultimate future redemption. Because from that time, the prophets of that time already started to prophecy about the future redemption. They were already talking about the impending destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash if the Jews didn't do tshuva, but they were at the same time prophesying about the ultimate future redemption. And the matter was hanging in the balance. Im Yizku, that if they merited, that if the Jews merited, if they did tshuva, then they would have been redeemed immediately during the times of Chizkiah or Yoshia, two very righteous kings towards the end of the first Beis HaMikdash period. They were leaders of mass tshuva movements. They didn't quite hit the mark. They didn't quite go as far as they needed to go. But if they did reach that mark, if the Jews merited, then the ultimate redemption would have happened in that time. The first Beis HaMikdash would not have been destroyed. There wouldn't be a second or third Beis HaMikdash. That would have been it. The Jews that were in exile would have all come back. Mashiach would have come, or one of the existing kings would have been Mashiach, and that would have been the end. Okay? But after they didn't merit, they missed the opportunity. Heglu leBavel. They were exiled to Bavel, b'malam, in their treason against Hashem, lechale pesha ulahasem chatas, in order to clean the slate of all of their sins. Kasher ra Hashem, but when Hashem saw Shimhayu nisharim begalus Bavel, that if they remained in the Babylonian exile, hayu nitmoim beino akum, they would have assimilated among the Goyim, vayu yotzim miklal adas, and they would have left Judaism. Shekvaris arvu zera kodesh be'amei ha'aratzos, because they had already started to assimilate. The holy seed had already started to mingle and intermarry with the other nations. V'shachachu l'shona v'torasam, they started to forget their language and their Torah. We see from Sefer Malachi, which we'll get to in Chagai itself later on. Chagai is very critical of the Kohanim who came back in the first wave of Aliyah. He tested them, and many of them seemingly failed the test. They didn't know the basic laws of Tumah and Tara that they needed to know for the service of the Beis HaMikdash. So this happened in a span of 70 years. So either these were original Kohanim, most likely they were well beyond the age of service. So we're talking about their children or their grandchildren who came back. But in that short span of time, the grandfathers had not managed to transfer their knowledge to the children. The children didn't learn the basic laws of being a Kohen. So certainly the Jews that remained in Bavel, they really started to drift far from Torah. Therefore Hashem remembered them. He visited upon them a little bit in the times of Koresh. He didn't give them the full redemption. He gave them a little bit. He gave them a taste, a partial redemption in the times of Koresh, through Koresh. And it came up with them, the men of the great assembly, and they restored the Torah and the crown to its former glory. In other words, this was an emergency. Okay, the Jews had the opportunity for the ultimate redemption to happen during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash. They failed, therefore they had to get punished and be exiled from the land. And then they were going to stay in exile for a very, very long time until they did tshuva. But there was a problem in Hashem's plan, and that was the Jews were deteriorating so rapidly. Just in a span of 70 years, they were intermarrying, assimilating, forgetting their language and their Torah, that Hashem said, I've got to hit the pause button on this exile, otherwise the Jews are going to be lost completely, God forbid. I have to bring them back to Israel just to recharge their batteries, just so they can restore the Torah to its former glory. Okay? Meaning the second Beis HaMikdash, according to this, was not intended to be the ultimate final redemption, but a stopgap measure to stop the bleeding, to stop the spiritual bleeding of the Jews, so they could go back into exile and then handle the exile properly without losing everything. Really an incredible idea that we're learning over here. Even though at that time it was not yet the time of the ultimate redemption, the Jews had not merited it. There's a certain deadline that can come even if we don't merit it. That deadline had not come either. So therefore, there was not the right time to bring the Jews back to Israel, but Hashem had to do it anyway. And Daniel in his vision saw 4 kingdoms that were going to rule over Israel, and that had certainly not happened yet. The visions had not been realized. And so other prophets also saw similar visions about the future that clearly had not come to pass during these 70 years. And they informed the Jews of this in visions. That the time of the end of all of these wonders at the end of days was very, very far into the future. We still haven't seen it yet. Because in spite of all this, Here's an astounding comment. In spite of this, there was still a possibility that this could now be the time of the ultimate redemption. If they fully returned to Hashem, meaning that Hashem brought the Jews back to Israel not because they were being redeemed, but because it was an emergency to recharge their batteries. But now that they're already here, that opened up sort of a back door to bring the redemption already. Well, we're already here. You didn't come for the right reasons. It's not yet the right time. But nevertheless, you're already here. We're so close. Do some tshuva, and then this can be transformed into the ultimate redemption, and you can cheat your way out of the gullus, a shortcut out of the gullus. Incredible idea. If you do tshuva, and here the next words are really astounding, and they're the basis of the title of my sefer, V'hayu olim kulam kichoma, and if they all went up like a wall, if they all made aliyah like a wall. Now, those who are a little more learned may recognize this line. This line comes from the famous Gemara at the end of Ksubos and the Medrash and Shir HaShirim, which we will talk about at a later shir, the famous 3 oaths. Okay, one of which was that the Jews would not go up like a wall. That apparently Hashem made the Jewish people swear. This is an allegory because there was no particular time in history where actual human beings stood up and took an oath to Hashem, but it's really an expression of Hashem's will, but that's something we'll talk about later on. Nevertheless, it seems to be Hashem's will in the status of an oath that the Jews will not return to Israel like a wall. And to this very day, many Jews say we're not allowed to make aliyah en masse. We're not allowed to have Jewish sovereignty over the state of Israel. The whole land, the whole state of Israel is born in sin and exists in sin, and we shouldn't make aliyah. We should have nothing to do with the state because of this isolated medrash. And yet here the Malbim says that this was dafka the opposite of the truth. Hashem wanted the Jews to do tshuva and make aliyah like a wall. He knew what line he was using. He knew what line he was borrowing and what that line implied. And he was saying over here that when the window of opportunity is open, when Hashem is allowing the Jews to go to Israel, especially when the king of Persia, the most powerful goy in the world, is saying, I authorize the Jews to go, that is a clear sign from Hashem that the oath has been abrogated, that you are now allowed to go, and therefore you are obligated to go. Hashem wants you to go. That is part of the tshuva process, the returning process, the physical return to the land of Israel. So the Malbim is saying here very clearly, had the Jews done tshuva, full tshuva to Hashem, and gone up like a wall, meaning en masse, had they gotten the sign, had they gotten the message and realized that the window was open, they could go back now, they were allowed to go, encouraged to go, and therefore Hashem wanted them to go, then this would have been the ultimate redemption. The only thing holding it back was that they chose to stay in Gullus. Chazal, as Chazal said, so the Jews were worthy, meaning it should have been. The time was ripe for miracles to happen for the Jews in the times of Ezra. He came up with a second wave of Aliyah later on. Why did massive miracles not happen? Why did this not transform into the ultimate redemption with all the bells and whistles? Because the Jews sinned. They did not live up to the standards. They didn't do tshuva properly. Also, there are many midrashic statements of Chazal that also teach this idea that Hashem Dafka wanted the Jews to go up during Bayit Sheni. And you should be getting chills because we're living in a very parallel time today where the Goyim of the world authorized the Jews to go back to Israel, and they should have recognized this is an expression of Hashem's will, that whatever oaths are floating around somewhere that we're not supposed to go back have been abrogated. We're allowed to go. The Goyim are authorizing us to go. Therefore, there's no oath, and we're now obligated to go. That is part of the tshuva process, and we dafka should be going up like a wall. That's the message that we should be getting over here. Ube'es nivna habayis. And when the Beis HaMikdash was built, talking about the second Beis HaMikdash now, the possibility was still hanging in the balance. Is this going to be the ultimate redemption, or will it just be a temporary interruption of the exile to recharge their batteries and they're going to go back? There were 2 roads that the Jews could have taken, and it was up to them. If the Jews returned in tshuva, which included making aliyah en masse, Zerubbabel HaMelech HaMashiach. Zerubbabel, as we learned last time, was the governor of Yerushalayim, and he was a great-grandson of Yechaniah, one of the kings from the house of David, so he would have been Mashiach. When we think about Mashiach, we normally don't think of Zerubbabel. When we think of the greatest Jews, the most righteous Jews who ever lived, who theoretically could have been Mashiach, that's not usually the first name that pops into people's minds. But here, very clearly, says the Malbim, and we'll see it illustrated from the Psukim, He was eligible to be Mashiach. He had the potential and would have been Mashiach had the Jews seized the opportunity and merited it. Instead, he only became the governor. And the Beis HaMikdash that they had rebuilt would have been Hashem's permanent dwelling place instead of just a temporary recharging of the batteries. And therefore, it's shown upon the Jews once again the light of prophecy through the final prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Hashem sent them prophecy. Prophecy had essentially been stopped during the Gullus period, and it was restored to them now to give the Jews a little push because they weren't getting the message, as we'll see. And Hashem really wanted it to work out, even though that wasn't the original intention. The original intention was just to stop the bleeding. But now that they were already here, Hashem's mercy was aroused and says, we're so close. We have the Jews in Israel. We have a Beis HaMikdash. We have a tzaddik by the name of Zerubbabel, who's eligible to be Mashiach. We're so close. The Jews just do a little tshuva. They just come back to Israel a little bit more, and that's the end. It's the end of days. So Hashem sent prophets to them to inspire them and instruct them and ultimately to warn them that they should seize the opportunity. He restored prophecy to them. That they stood up at that time, and they were trying to arouse the people regarding the building of the Beis HaMikdash, which they had stopped after the building freeze, and on doing tshuva. And they revealed to them this secret that it all depended on them. Is this going to be the final redemption? Or is it just going to be a blip on the radar and then you're going back to Gullus for thousands of years? But after they didn't merit, the second Beis HaMikdash turned out to be only a temporary Beis HaMikdash for the time. It lasted for 420 years, but we know that it was a very bloody time, lots of civil wars, lots of very bad kings. It didn't work out very well. Most of the time of the second Beis HaMikdash was not really a glorious period of Jewish history. So it was a temporary Beis HaMikdash, and then it was destroyed. And it became destined to be destroyed by the Romans. And it was lacking 5 very important things, as Chazal hinted to us from the word ve'ekavda, which appears in Pasuk Ches, in verse 8 of the first chapter of Chagai. We'll get to it, the 5 important things that were lacking from the second Beis HaMikdash. They didn't have everything they needed, but they had a taste of what it's like to have a Beis HaMikdash. During the days of the first Koresh, the instruction was given, Sheyalu la'Eretz Yisrael, that Hashem visited upon them, gave them the opportunity that they should make Aliyah to Israel. V'eschilu az v'binyan Bayit, and they started to build the Beis HaMikdash. V'nishpas al yedei tzari Yehuda u'Binyamin ad zman dar Yavesh, and they were stopped. They were halted by the enemies of Yehuda and Binyamin, as we saw last time. They slandered them to the king, wrote a letter to the king, and the building was frozen until the times of Dar Yavesh. Rashi here says that this king was in fact the son of Esther. Who knows? Because why was it stopped? It was because it wasn't yet the right time to build the Beis HaMikdash, because the 70 years for the building of the second Beis HaMikdash was supposed to start from the time that the final exile happened, from the actual destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. 70 years from then was the time to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. The 70 years that the Jews had counted with the first Aliyah was the 70 years of a previous exile, and they thought that when 70 years came from that, it was time to build the Beis HaMikdash. However, from that time, it was only the time for the Jews to now undo that exile and start coming back, but not yet to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So they simply didn't count correctly. They didn't know when to start the clock. Valkain hisyashu min habinyan. Therefore, when the building freeze happened, they gave up hope of building the Beis HaMikdash. They thought that they counted the 70 years starting from the right time, and therefore the time came and went. The prophecy should have been fulfilled, and it wasn't. So they gave up. They said, "We don't know what happened. We don't understand." But it's all hopeless now. The time came and went, and we couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash, so it's over. And it's not what Hashem wants us to do. Because they didn't get any further authorization from the king to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So the building freeze was still in effect, so they gave up. V'niba Chagai b'shem Hashem, and Chagai prophesied in the name of Hashem, as we'll see shortly from the Psukim, sheyaschilu b'binyan, that they should start building. V'lo yamtinu al rishayon, they shouldn't even wait for permission from the king. Imagine this bold action that he was telling these 42,000, mostly old men to do, that they're surrounded by enemies, and they have an order from the king not to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. And he's now coming and telling them, build it without permission. Don't wait for permission. They had permission to start building it earlier. That was then taken away from them. And Haggai is now coming and saying, rebuild without permission. And as we'll see very shortly, they shouldn't have even waited for the Navi to tell them. This is incredibly astounding what we are going to learn. It's going to be one bombshell after another. Okay, so he said, don't even wait for the king to authorize it, just start building again. Vaya dibur el Zerubbabel, and the word came from Haggai to Zerubbabel, that if they merited, vaya az hageula ha'amitis, then that this turned into the true redemption, then the horn would have sprouted, would have blossomed from the house of David. It was Zerubbabel haya Mashiach, and Zerubbabel would be Mashiach. He would get a major upgrade from merely a governor to Mashiach. Rak achar shelo zachu, but after they didn't merit, the Jews did not heed the call. They decided to stay in Galus, and the Jews in Israel didn't live up to the proper standards. Shav Zerubbabel abavel v'meisham. Incredible here. I don't know of any textual source for this, but we apparently have a tradition to this effect, is that Zerubbabel returned to Bavel and died there. That this tzaddik from the house of David, the potential Mashiach himself, didn't even live out his days in Israel when you had the second Beis HaMikdash. He moved back to Bavel. Unclear why, and that's where he died. How the story took a tragic turn. However, this blossoming will come from his descendants in the end of days, meaning the prophecy will be kicked down the road. He did not merit, it didn't work out in his time for him to be Mashiach, but it will come at a future time. Okay? All right, that's what the Malbim says over here. Just to recap in brief, the Jews should have returned like a wall. Once they were authorized to return to Israel, they shouldn't have waited for a Navi to tell them. They should have all gone up en masse. They should have recognized that there were no oaths blocking them. There were no halachos blocking them. Hashem wanted them to come, and that's Tafka why he opened up the door. Not like some people say that it's Maisis Satan, that the Satan is so powerful that he arranged for the Jews to build up Israel and millions of people to come here. I mean, it's incredible. People think that the Holocaust was an act of God, but the rebuilding of the state of Israel is an act of Satan. I mean, how the clever Jewish mind manages to twist things around, to rationalize all sorts of craziness. Dafka, when we're allowed to go back in Israel, that is everything as Hashem's will. The Holocaust was Hashem's will. The rebuilding of the state of Israel is Hashem's will. If Hashem gives us the opportunity to come, we should recognize if the door is open, Hashem wants us to go in through that door. And if we do that, that ushers in the redemption period. Now translate to modern times. We've had a state of Israel with all of its flaws and shortcomings, and there's many of them. I've spoken at great length about all the flaws and shortcomings of the leadership of this country, and I'm not going to go into it now, okay? We're very, very far from what a true Jewish state should be. Nevertheless, we have the right to live here, and we have certain privileges once we are living here. We can't do everything that we want to do, but we have the right to do a lot. And many, many Jews in Golas are not heeding the call. They're not getting the message. They're making every excuse under the sun. If you ask 1,000 Jews why they're not living in Israel, you'll get 1,000 different answers. Okay, there's so many reasons that the clever Jewish mind can come up with not to live in Israel. And they don't realize if the door is open, throw all your excuses out the window, unless it's truly extenuating circumstances. If somebody is in hospital and needs hospital care, you're caring for an elderly parent. I mean, it's truly extenuating circumstances. But 99% of people can make it work, can make an effort. I'm not saying drop everything and come tomorrow, although that's probably a good idea considering the way the rest of the world is turning these days. But you should have it on your radar. You should narrow down the list of obstacles to overcome to making Aliyah to a bare minimum, and then be actively striving to overcome those obstacles and come as soon as possible. It should be an active goal, not a theoretical goal. I'd love to live in Israel someday, somehow, at some point. There should be a very clear battle plan in your mind. How am I going to get to Israel? What is stopping me? What are the challenges that I face? Who can I talk to who's gone through the similar experiences, who's faced similar challenges, who can help me through the process? How can I overcome these challenges? Be actively striving to overcome that. And when you're given the opportunity, seize it and go and don't look back. That is the call that Hashem has given us by allowing us to come to Israel. And if we do, that will bring the final redemption. Very, very clear message just from the first Malbim alone. This is just an introduction to Sefer Haggai. Let's start a little bit of the chapter today. Again, it's only 2 chapters, but there's so much here to talk about, so we're going to split it up into several classes. Okay, so it starts as follows. Bishnas Shtayim li Daryavesh HaMelech, in the 2nd year of King Daryavesh, B'chodesh HaShishi, in the 6th month, B'yom Echad HaChodesh, and Rosh Chodesh, the 1st day of the month, Hayadvar Hashem b'yad Haggai Hanavi El Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel Pachas Yehuda. The word of Hashem came through Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, the governor of Yehuda, Ve'el Yoshua ben Yosadak HaKohen HaGadol Lamar, and to Yoshua ben Yosadak, the Kohen Gadol, saying, Koamar Hashem Tzvakos Lemar, so says Hashem, the God of hosts, saying, Ha'ama ze Amru, these people have said, Lo espo, the time has not come. Espace Hashem lihibanos, the time of the house of Hashem to be built. Now, this is the first message that Haggai gives the people. There's actually a break in the text. There's like a little pay in the Chumash, which indicates that this is like an end of a paragraph or end of a speech. Okay, so what is the prophecy exactly? The people have said it's not the time to build the Beis HaMikdash. Well, we already know that, right? The people have said it themselves. I don't need a Navi to tell me what the people already know. So is the Navi giving Musar to the people? Is he criticizing them? Is he instructing them? Is he actually informing them of something that they don't yet know? It's unclear what the Navi is actually intending to drive home with this statement. So Rashi says as follows in Pasuk Beis: Lefisha bitlu oiveim al yadeim barishona, because their enemies had stopped them from building in the beginning. Sevurim heim, they think, he's explaining the prophecy of Haggai. He's saying the people think Shelo akaim estavari, that I will not fulfill my words. Hashem is saying the people think I'm not going to keep my word. Shamarti, that I said lefi malos echavros Yerushalayim ayin shana, that when there's 70 years from the destruction of Yerushalayim, you will rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Below Yavo owed a spacey banos. So the Jews said, because the 70 years have seemingly passed and the prophecy was not fulfilled, the time is never going to come. That's what the Jews thought. The Beis HaMikdash is never going to be rebuilt. It's all over. Amar lahem. So Hashem said to Haggai, tell them, say to them, Shebo ato eis, now the time has come. Aval eis harishon lohaya el lepekida lamalos letchilos malchus Bavel shivim shana. That the first time, the earlier time when you started counting the 70 years, was not the complete rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. That was just me visiting you, me allowing you to come back to Israel. That was the 70 years that you started counting was from the time of the beginning of the kingdom of Bavel. So that was just a time for you to be allowed to come back to Israel, but not yet to rebuild. So my prophecy still stands. It's not that the prophecy failed. The prophecy doesn't fail. It's just that the time wasn't there yet. You counted wrong. And so it was. It's 70 years after the kingdom of Bavel started. That's when Koresh allowed the Jews to go back. But the building of the Beis HaMikdash depended on the destruction of Jerusalem in the days of Tzidkiyahu, 70 years from that time. That was 18 years after the kingdom of Babylonia was started. So that's why they had to wait 18 years. That's why there was a building freeze. The building freeze had nothing to do with politics. It had nothing to do with the weakness of the people, right? It had nothing to do with how they were playing the games with the leaders and writing letters to Congress. It had nothing to do with that. It's just that it wasn't yet the time. So according to Rashi, Hashem is in fact informing the people, you said it wasn't the time to build the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore it will never be built. It's because you counted wrong. The prophecy stands, and now is the right time. Hashem is informing the Jews and encouraging them. However, see how Radak explains this prophecy. This is also on Pasuk Beis. He says, we'll start we'll start in the middle over here. He says, we'll do the whole thing. It's not that long. It says, Kol Mar Hashem Lamar. So says Hashem saying, Sheyamru Haim La'am, that they should say to the people, Ulefisha Batlu Tzara Yehuda Mehem Binyan Abayis Kol Hashanim Sha'avru, that because, again, the enemies of the Jews had stopped them from building all of these years that had passed. No, Ashu Ami Binyan Abayis, the Jews again had given up hope from building the house. So far, he says exactly what Rashi is saying. Vayu Omrim, and they were saying, Adayin Lo Egia Esa Binyan, that the time has not yet come to build. Afal Pi Shayu Yodim Sheshalmu Shimshana Lecharvos Yerushalayim B'Shna Shtayim L'Daryavesh. Even though the Jews knew that there was now 70 years had passed, right from the time of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash until the second year of Daryavesh, they could have realized on their own that there was another significant 70-year period that had passed now, namely from the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. They should have realized on their own that maybe they counted wrong, because here's another big 70-year period. B'haya lahem ladas, and they should have known. These are the key words. Ki lo lechinam helo akel mi'agol. It's not for nothing Hashem brought them out of the exile. What do you think? Hashem brought you back to Israel to plant fields? Nothing else? He brought you here for a larger purpose. If Hashem brought you here back to Israel, it's because this is the fulfillment of a prophecy to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. There's no other reason for you to be in Israel other than to build a truly Jewish state. That's the point. That's the point of a Jewish people. That's the point of a Jewish land. He didn't bring you back for nothing. And again, translate to modern times. You think Hashem brought the Jews back to Israel for nothing? So we have a nice place to go on vacation, a nice Jewish theme park. So we have a refuge from a future Holocaust, as the original Zionists only intended it to be, but nothing more than that. Israel is merely a safe haven, a Jewish theme park, a nice place to study for a couple of years, a nice place to be buried. Is that all Israel is? Hashem essentially brought us back for nothing? Of course not. Hashem brought us here for much bigger things, and we're not supposed to wait passively for that time to come. They should have known that Hashem didn't bring them out of exile for nothing. Even though the Navi had not yet told them to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, they should have started on their own. Now, again, who are we talking to? We're talking to 42,360 people, which is 1/3 of the size of Beit Shemesh today. They were mostly elderly people. I'm talking 80s and 90s. Elderly people. They were besieged by enemies on all sides. They were not happy to see them there. They did not have permission from the king to rebuild at this point. There was a building freeze for 18 years, and the most powerful Gentile in the world had forbade them from rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. They did not yet have prophets in their midst, and yet they should have realized on their own, Hashem wanted them to get up without permission, without regard for their enemies, and recommence building the Beis HaMikdash, because it's not for nothing that Hashem brought them there. So according to Radak, this first statement of Chagai is not just informing the Jews, like Rashi says, that you counted wrong, but it's actually critical of the Jews. It's giving them Musar. Why did you need a Navi to come along and tell you to build the Beis HaMikdash? You have brains. You can put 2 and 2 together. You should understand that you're here for a reason. Go build. Don't worry so much about all the problems. Go do what you have to do and let Hashem take care of the rest. This is an astounding statement over here. I'll read it again. Even though the Navi didn't yet tell them anything, they should have nevertheless started on their own and to awaken themselves about this. Because they should have seen that all of their things were not working out. They should have seen, as the Navi will continue in the coming psukim, that their business ventures, their crops were not succeeding, and it was going against the nature of the world. They were failing in very strange ways. They should have realized that's a message from Hashem. I'm not happy with you. I want you to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Why are your crops failing? Why are you losing money? Why are you having problems? It's dafka because you're only concerned about your business and your fields, and you're not concerned about the Beis HaMikdash. And they should have seen that as a message. And they should have known, they should have realized on their own that this was a punishment for them. Again, we're supposed to think. We're supposed to look around and realize what's going on. Today, people are very intimidated from trying to connect terrorist attacks or other bad things that happen to sins of the Jews, right? They say, oh, you're blaming the victims, or who are you to give Musar? Who are you to try to fathom Hashem's ways? Granted, it might not always be easy to connect the dots from any specific punishment or incident to a particular sin, but we're supposed to do that. Because I'll say, if we have problems in our lives, you fashfesh b'masav, examine your actions, try to uncover what the spiritual cause of it is. And certainly as a nation, if bad things are happening to the nation, the entire nation has to be fashfesh b'masav, examine its actions and try to understand, why is Hashem doing it to us? And if you don't get it right the first time, if we rectify something, we attempt to rectify something, we still have the problems, okay, so we'll go to plan B, try to rectify something else. At least you still rectified something, right? It doesn't matter, even if you don't get it right the first time. When there was a famine in the times of King David, of David, at the end of his reign, Chazal say it took him a while. He sent messengers all over Israel examining, are the Jews serving idolatry? Are they doing this sin or that sin? He couldn't figure out what the Jews were doing wrong. He was trying to find out what the Jews were doing wrong until a Navi finally came and told him. But that's the proper Jewish response. When there are bad things happening, do a spiritual inventory, try to figure out what the sin is, and then start rectifying things. It's a time to do mass tshuva. And that's what Chagai was saying to the Jews here. You're having problems in Israel. Try to figure out what the problem is. And the most obvious problem, he said, was that you stopped from rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. And you should have realized, without me. Okay? He said, and they should have realized this was their punishment, that they gave up on building the Beis HaMikdash. Now, as rational, logical people, they had every reason in the world to give up from rebuilding the Beis HaMikdash. And nevertheless, the Navi says they were wrong for doing so, and they were punished for doing so. When Hashem saw that the Jews were not getting the message on their own, they weren't awakening themselves, he sent them the message in the hands of Chagai. That's why Chagai came. The Navi came as a plan B. Hashem said, figure it out without a Navi. You can't figure it out without a Navi. Fine. I want you to get the message. I want you to succeed. I want this to be the ultimate redemption, even though it was not my plan at the outset. So now I'm sending you a Navi to try to get your heads on straight, to get you on the right track and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. This is an incredible comment from Radak, a Rishon, which flies in the face of the modern Jewish mentality today, that we have to sit passively, we'll wait for Mashiach to come before we even make Aliyah. Wrong. The door is open. That's a clear sign from Hashem. He wants us to come en masse. Okay, we'll wait passively before we rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Now, I'm certainly not poskening that we should take out our hammers and nails and start building a Beis HaMikdash today. We can't do that. I'm certainly not, capable of saying such a thing. However, we should be striving for that. We should be preparing to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, gathering the building materials, raising the money, right? Getting everything together. So when the time comes, we'll be ready to go. We should be demonstrating to Hashem that we are going up as far as we can go to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. We're going to do everything in our power to get that process started, to show that we really want it. That is our obligation. We don't need a Navi to tell us this. We don't need Eliyahu Navi to come and tell us this. We know it from Chagai. Chagai is speaking to us today because Chagai told it to us back then. It's exactly the same today, and we should get the message. We don't need Mashiach to give us this message. It's a shame to the Jews that they needed a Navi to come and tell them this. Okay, we'll do one more Malbim for today, and then we'll call it a day. We got a lot more to do just from this parak alone. We'll do the next two psukim and then one more Malbim. The word of Hashem came through Chagai the prophet, saying, is it now the time for you to dwell in your homes? Sifunim covered, you're living in nice, fancy, protected homes. And yet this house, meaning my house, the Beis HaMikdash, is in a state of ruins. Think to yourself, you're living in a mansion, you're living in a nice home, and my home is in ruins. So see what the Malbim says over this. He says on Pasuk Beis, going back to that, because we're going to go through his next couple of comments. He says, the Jews had a tradition from their earlier prophets that before the true ultimate redemption comes, you need to see all kinds of signs and wonders on heaven and earth. You have to have the big war of Gog and Magog, which had clearly not happened yet. As all the prophets prophesied regarding the end of days. And they saw that at that time, at this early stage of the second Beis HaMikdash period, none of these signs had come true, which indicated that the final redemption was here. Therefore, Amru, they said in Pasuk Beis, Lo Eis Po Eis, the time has not yet come. Ratzalomer, meaning to say, Lo Yesh Ho Eis Shiachana Al Bias Ho Eis Shibana Beis Hashem. Clearly, the ground is not yet laid. The time is not yet right for us to build the house of Hashem. The Jews were saying, I'm not going to read the whole comment. He says, it can't be. Hashem wants us to build the Beis HaMikdash. We're waiting for Gog and Magog. We're waiting for signs and wonders. We're waiting for Eliyahu Navi. We're waiting for all kinds of incredible things to happen, and nothing really out of nature has happened yet. Sure, it's really incredible that Koresh allowed us to come back, but that's not an open miracle. That's not signs and wonders and changes of nature. That's following the natural order of things. So since we haven't had these prophecies being fulfilled, it's not yet the time to build the Beis HaMikdash. So skipping now to what the Malbim says on Pasuk Daled, he says, Ha'eis lachem, it's at the time for you, Ratzalomer, meaning to say, V'chi al zeh sheteshvu b'vatechem sefunim yesh eis, is it the time for you to be dwelling in nice fancy homes? Halo gam lo zeh tzorech sheyavu eis sheyadu anavim. Doesn't this also require a certain time to come that the prophets had promised about? Sheteshvu b'shalva, that you will dwell in peace and tranquility. The einatem sholim bozel al eis miyuad. And you're not asking about that, right? Before you built your fancy mansion, you didn't say, is it the time for me to build a fancy home in Israel? But all of these signs and wonders haven't happened. That didn't bother you. When it came to your personal life, you didn't wait for signs and wonders. You didn't wait for prophecies to be fulfilled. You didn't wait for a Navi to come and give you instructions. Sure, go build a fancy house and go plant fields in Israel and go make millions of dollars and party on in life. You didn't wait for that. You didn't need a Navi then, so why do you need a Navi now when it comes to my house? And this house, my Beis HaMikdash, should be destroyed in ruins. Al zet tishalu, about this. Suddenly you have all these questions. You have all these shilas. If the time has come, you're a bunch of hypocrites. You're a bunch of hypocrites, says the Navi. Okay, these are just the opening words of Chagai to the people. Now, again, Rashi says the first pasuk, the first message from Chagai was simply informing and encouraging the people, but Radak and Malbim take a different approach. They are very, very sharply critical of the people for doing things that, for basically taking a very passive approach. And again, think to today. The doors are open. We have the opportunity to do a lot of things in spite of the Erev Rav government that we have, in spite of all the enemies that we have around us and all the enemies who come dressed as friends that are even worse enemies. We have a lot of impediments today and a lot of problems today. Nevertheless, we're supposed to get certain things on our own. One of them is Hashem wants us, Dafka, to go up like a wall, and Hashem wants us to start pushing the envelope, to start moving things forward, to recognize He did not bring us here for nothing. We don't need a Navi, living Navi, to tell us this because it's already on the books. These are living words that I'm sharing with you today. These are living instructions for us today.
Wouldn't you say regarding rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, in a way, it's quite parallel to the whole question of coming to Israel? In other words, in the same way that we shouldn't be waiting for a Navi to come back to Israel, we shouldn't be waiting for something incredible to happen for us to build the Beit HaMikdash. We should be figuring things out, digging, and doing whatever needs to be done.
That's exactly what the message was. Yeah, even David HaMelech, he wanted to build the first Beit HaMikdash, and Hashem said, "You're not going to do it. Your son will do it." Did David say, "Okay, fine, I'll go party for the rest of my life"? No, he got everything together. He raised all the money. He made the building plans. Right? He did everything up to the point that he was allowed to. He even laid the foundation of the Beit HaMikdash. He got the process started up to the point that he was allowed to go. And then he handed it over to his son. We should be going as far as we're able to go, and then hopefully Hashem will allow us to go further.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.